A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
On a Thursday, we like to check in with Family Voice Australia and back with some more talk about mature views of government. Andrew McColl, the Family Voice Australia State Director for Queensland. Andrew, a special welcome back to 2020.
Good morning, Neil, and good morning, listeners.
Andrew, I know you like to start with a biblical foundation because I guess if you're talking mature views of government, you've got a divine perspective in all of this. Where do we start in a conversation today around these mature views from the scriptures?
Well, I thought I'd read, Neil, from Psalm 106, verses 4 and 5, which says, "Remember me, O Lord, in your favour toward your people. Visit me with your salvation, that I may see the prosperity of your chosen ones, that I may rejoice in the gladness of your nation, that I may glory with your inheritance." So the psalmist takes confidence and takes hope in God's promises to him, uses these terms, your chosen ones, your nation, your inheritance. And as we reflect upon what's taken place in the US a couple of weeks ago now, on that Tuesday, or was it big day, I think it's the first Tuesday in November, seems like Melbourne Cup Day over here in Australia.
That's right.
Sort of correlates very neatly with the Australian situation. Not quite the same, but nonetheless a big Tuesday. I thought I'd consider what took place and really look, Neil, at why voting Trump was essential.
All right. Well, let's look at some of those reasons why people might have voted Trump. And this is whether they're, I guess, in some sense here, Christian motivation or no Christian motivation. Let's talk about some of the positives and some of the negatives. Start with some of the positives, though. So why do you think that voting Trump was essential for the American people?
Well, probably the first thing, Neil, is that Trump knows what a man is or a woman is, and he has no time for transgender. And as a consequence of that, we hope and pray that the whole transgender push all around the world has begun to lose its impetus and will be exposed for the lie that it always was.
And, of course, there's going to be levels of compassion for those who are in the mix there, who are in some sense victims of some misleading information around transgender issues. But, yes, by and large, there's not going to be a lot of sympathy from a lot of Christians who see transgender as being something that becomes a threat to Christianity, even causing there to be a criminalisation of Christian positions there. So what else do you see as a positive?
Well, we can be glad that he's happy to let the states continue to decide about abortion, not the Supreme Court. So this will not mean that abortion ceases in the US, but it will mean that the decisions are made by each of the 50 states, which can be lobbied by the voters. It's not really appropriate for individuals to lobby the Supreme Court, but it is appropriate to say to their local state government in the US, hey, look, guys, we don't want you to vote this way. We want you to vote another way. And if you don't, we will vote against you. That puts the members in the Parliament over there, that's not quite the right term, is it, the Parliament, but certainly the Congress, the House of Reps, especially, they have to think, well, gee, if I take this position, pro-abortion or anti-abortion, there will be hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people who will vote against me next election. I'm not sure I want to face all those sorts of people. And so they have to think about that. So I think that's a very wise thing. I think it's appropriate that the Supreme Court didn't deal with it as a yes, it's right or no, it's wrong issue, which was the problem going back to Roe versus Wade. It comes back to the individuals, and always, I think Christians should always look for decisions to be made as much as possible locally, because that's decentralised. What we like to be able to do is make out in my house with my family, I want to be able to make some decisions with some consultation, of course, Neil. But nonetheless, we don't want to say, oh, let that decision be made somewhere else. No, in my house, this is how we're going to do things.
And of course, in the US, if we were contrasting the US to Australia, there's some states now in the US that really have basically outlawed abortion. In Australia,
Yes.
all of our states, this is where the US caught up with where Australians were at, and all of our states and territories have basically got this sort of unlimited abortion. So it may well take the responsibility away from the Supreme Court in the US, but in Australia, we're seeing what happens when you've got governments that won't make any sort of safety rails around abortion, and you've got open slather. So, so at least in the US, there are some states that are standing up and saying no, but in Australia, we've got everyone saying yes right now, haven't we?
Well, we have, and so hopefully that is something that we can continue to address. And I know that the matter has been going on now for something like over 30 years. We would all, when I say we, almost all Christians would love to see the laws change in the states of Australia, and that is an opportunity for us to deal with. You'd be aware that in the last Queensland election, that came up. It's obviously a matter to be coming before the Parliament early next year. I understand in terms of the Babies Born Alive legislation, which the Katter Party has put forward, which I'm very, very pleased about. And we look forward to changes coming. It doesn't matter if the steps are incremental, one at a time. One at a time, over time, is a lot better than nothing at all. So that will be great for Australia.
I note in some notes here I have, you're also giving reference to Trump stopping illegal immigrants, and that's been a part of, is one of the main planks of his election campaign, wasn't it? About having the right to, hold people back unless they're entering through the right corridor. This is one of those issues too, you're saying is a positive?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, why did President Biden ignore tens of thousands of immigrants coming in illegally every month? To my mind, Neil, that was absolutely unconscionable. Trump says he wants to stop the illegal immigrants, send them back, and this will be absolutely essential for US security. I mean, it's almost beyond belief why any national government would open its borders, in fact, to even sponsor people coming across the border and then put them on an airplane or a bus to send them somewhere else in the country and provide for them there, when there's absolutely no check on who they are, what is their background, why are they coming, do they have any criminal convictions in the past. So, yes, I think it's a big step forward that Trump wants to do this.
Another one on a list here, he'll investigate corrupt bureaucracies. The first time he was president, he said he was going to drain the swamp, and I think that was reference to corrupt bureaucracies. What are your thoughts on that being a positive in his election? Well,
we've noticed that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, the CIA and the FBI, there is evidence, Neil, to suggest that they have actually conspired to hide criminals while prosecuting innocent people. You would remember, Neil, there was a lot of talk a few years ago about a certain infamous laptop that somehow never got to a prosecution. Why would that be? Well, the individual concerned was the son of the president. Does that point us to some kind of interference in the courts of law, interference with the courts of justice? There's another word for that kind of thing called nepotism, where certain people who are favoured by certain people in government, there seems to be a blind eye sent towards their behaviour. And so that's an important step, has potential to catch some really high-ranking rats who have been protected by government agencies in the US.
Yes, and your reference there to Hunter Biden, the son of Joe Biden, that laptop, and if that hangs around like a bad smell, there may be some way they'll be forced to have some sort of inquiry or sort of, legal investigation into that. But yes, I think that's been floating around, but certainly not covered by the left-wing mainstream media in the US, who did seem to be collaborating there and on side to keep all of that quiet. Hey, let's talk about wars and Donald Trump's attitudes to wars. What are your thoughts here?
Well, what is good to see that here we have a US president that wants to get their nation out of wars. There have been 2 wars, as we would all know, taking place, one in the Ukraine, one with Israel and Gaza. There has been a lot of destruction and a loss of innocent life, including lots of civilians. Now, those matters have not been resolved, but wouldn't it be a good idea to get the nation, get the wars to actually cease? It's amazing. The price of gold rises with tensions around the world. It dropped around $200 an ounce post-election. So, and I'm seeing a direct correlation between those 2 facts: the dropping in tensions around the world, particularly in those areas, and that sudden sharp drop in the price of gold. Already, Trump's been good for international security, Neil.
And it seems to be, if you were bringing some sort of maybe a counterbalance to the idea, that if the US withdraws its security arrangements around the world, really as being the kings of the oceans, if they withdraw some of that strength and power, that may actually open up all sorts of other issues that might well arise. Hey, let's talk about possibilities of nuclear war. I mean, it's one thing to get out of wars. Sometimes if you are getting out of wars and you relinquish that position of strongman, the strength, then potentially the nuclear threat comes into being. What are your thoughts here?
Absolutely. And that just in the last few months or prior to the election, there was considerable capacity for this to go terribly, terribly wrong. I think there have been some serious people in the US in their State Department and in the Foreign Affairs section who are making some very dangerous choices, playing a kind of Russian roulette and with Russia, all right, because it was very dangerous to be provoking the Russians. I mean, most people in Australia are not aware that the Russians have often been concerned about their security, in particular their security from Western invasion. Most of us don't know that the Russians lost 27 million people, when the Nazis invaded in 1941, or was it 42? 41, I think. That was a terrible, terrible loss that they faced. And so you can understand why they're pretty sensitive about people mucking around on their borders and threatening them with trying to put long-range missiles in the Ukraine. The Ukraine is not very far from Moscow. This is not, pardon the pun again, this is not rocket science. And so we can understand that the fact that Trump's been elected may very well bring a sigh of relief. We've noticed that Putin likes his idea of a Ukraine settlement. Well, wouldn't that be a good idea? Another great step ahead for the US.
And no doubt there'll be listeners who will be interested in monitoring that along too, and recognising that Russia has been invaded many times through their history. And if there is some sort of compromise settlement, and that doesn't sit well with everyone, but the formation of some form of demilitarised zone may actually work in the favour of both Russia in their defence and also keeping the Russians from the invasions of Ukraine. Hey, let's talk, the sorts of things that are in the media today, of course, are the types of people who are being appointed in a whole lot of different, very important roles. You've got some thoughts around economic policy?
Well, Mr. Trump's talking about appointing as a advisor in matters of money the former Senator Ron Paul. Now, I happen to have been a follower of Ron Paul for about 15 years, and he could be a great asset for the president. He's also talking the president, or he may, pardon the so-called January 6 conspirators. That would be a whole lot better, especially, Neil, as in my opinion, none of them had any kind of criminal intention. So all of these are very important things that he could do, and we hope he does do.
And, of course, there's a whole bunch of people in that mix too, including Elon Musk and, being put in charge of some cost-cutting bureaucracy out of Washington, which for him is a little bit like a hobby on the side as far as as what I'm reading. Hey, some negatives in all of this. I mean, those sorts of things, some will say there's some strengths in that. Others who might have a left-leaning way of thinking about this might think, well, that's all just a whole lot of, going along with, with a right-wing agenda. But when we're Christians and we say, how do we get above the fray, the left, the right? How do you think we understand these sorts of things? Is there something that Christians need to be around? A lot of Christians would see some of those things as real positives. What about some of the negatives?
Well, what we know is that after an election, there's a fair bit of enthusiasm, a fair bit of joy if your man has won or your woman has won. But I came across a quote written about 30 years ago by Robert Samuelson in an article he called Rhetoric Over Reality. And he said this: there's a massive confusion at the core of our politics. Against all evidence, everyone expects government to guarantee growth and higher living standards. It can't. Even the New Deal failed to pull the nation out of the Depression. World War II did that by boosting factory production. But the expectation of government as economic miracle worker is deeply entrenched, and politicians pander to it. So there are some negatives, or certainly potential negatives, Neil. The first one is that the notion of salvation by politics is an illusion. Changing the president doesn't make everything right, number two. Number three, Social Security and the massive Medicaid debt will just keep growing as usual. Much of the Washington swamp will remain unchanged. Number four, increased tariffs will help no one and they'll hurt Australian exporters. Number five, talk is cheap, but actions speak louder, and a large proportion of Americans still think their government can save them. It can't.
There's that really well-known scripture from Psalm 20, verse 7. Some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. There is a perspective in there, and if we're talking mature views of government, it's really putting government in context. This is the sort of thing you're talking about with these positives and the negatives, that we can't actually look to government as the saviour.
True. Absolutely. And so what I like to say in conclusion, Neil, is that Donald Trump's US election win was important, but hey, let's not be silly. Don't expect too much from the new President Trump. Otherwise, we'll be disillusioned.
And, of course, then there's also our own Australian domestic politics, federal election coming likely early next year, and some of these sorts of things that we've been observing as to how people have responded to various policy positions will, for some here in Australia, have some alarm bells ringing, and others might feel encouraged, certainly around some of those issues, that there's some Christian biblical alignment. Andrew McColl is the Family Voice Australia State Director for Queensland. To connect with Andrew, you can go online, familyvoice.org.au. I'll remind you too, Andrew's written a whole bunch of books. They Shall Become One, another one called The Significance of the Godly Family, one called Inherit the Earth, and the other, The Great Christian Revolution. Andrew McColl, always appreciate your insights. Thanks so much for being with us once again today on 2020.
Always a pleasure, Neil. Thank you so much.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.